Let's have another after-action report, as one of my play-by-post games finished a month ago or so. And I'd like to talk about how it went, what went wrong, what went right, and what I learned from it. As usual, the game was set on Karilan, my own kitchen sink fantasy setting. The exact location was determined randomly, so the game was set in Hevroia, a tyrannical theocracy ruled by the cult of Zaros. If you're familiar with D&D 3.5, you probably remember Zaros from the Races of Destiny book, a human supremacist deity. The entire nation is built upon human racial superiority and the strive to achieve the perfect state of body and mind. Thus, the priests of Zaros usually aren't calm and supportive old men, but something between Tomas de Torquemada, Coach Buzzcut, and Ziz. We had 4 players, 2 veterans and 2 players who were new to the system. Yoval Hyde, a young man from a merchant family. Unlike his parents and siblings, he didn't have a business mind, so instead he became an adept of the Lodge of Knowledge, basically the R&D department of the Church of Zaros. Aside from administrative and scribing skills, he became a wordcaster, a wizard that instead of learning spells from colleges, learns an assortment of power words that he combines to create a desired effect. This is one of the most convoluted of my spellcasting traditions, and it was surprising that a new player latched onto it, despite my warnings about being complicated and not even playtested. Well, now it got a playtest, but it made me realize that wordcasting is garbage, and I simply axed this tradition. Connor Avasco, another young man, a landless knight belonging to the Order of the Inexhaustible Chalice that serves the Church of Zaros and protects a relic, the chalice from which Zaros drank poison when attaining divinity. Fanatically devoted to the Church, Connor is a skilled fighter who spent most of his starting money on heavy armor, a bastard sword, and a heavy shield. Since he is a member of a religious order, he also possesses some religious skills. This is another character made by a new GURPS player. Marco Lico, a former poacher and ranger from one of the smaller baronies of Hevroia, who had to flee from law enforcement to the capital, where he signed a contract with the military. In the military, he served as a scout and pathfinder, where he had to track down squads of elves and dwarves for extermination. Scarred by this experience, he returned to civilian life, even if a very shady one. After going deep into debts and getting a criminal record, he was approached by an inquisitor and offered a job. Should he agree, his crimes would be forgiven and forgotten. Should he reject the proposal, he'd go to the prison and perhaps even straight to the gallows. Obviously, he agreed to serve the Inquisition. Irene Rinaldi, a fanatically devoted priestess of Zaros, fit, attractive, charismatic, smart, but also overconfident, fanatical, humorless, and law-abiding. Despite being an ordained priestess, her ranking in the church is low. However, she does possess some divine magic, able to bless others and increase physical characteristics. What I liked about this character lineup is that the character creation was heavily restricted due to the nature of the game, but the characters were very different, while still appropriate for the game. The game started with Olero Domine, one of the Inquisitors of Zaros, gathering everyone and giving them a quest. Teres Ramondo, one of the Wizards of the Lodge of Knowledge, is suspected to conduct dangerous research and contacting unknown people outside the walls of Ideal, the capital of Hevroia. These unknowns could be simple bandits or they could be spies from Jokun, a neighboring nation that is hostile to Hevroia, and also known as a place that practices devil worship and blood magic. The task is simple: observe, track, and find out what's going on. If the need arises, Teres Ramondo is to be arrested and taken to the Inquisitors, preferably unharmed. After some time, a plan was formulated by the party. Yoval goes to the Lodge of Knowledge and finds out whether Ramondo is there or not. If he is there, he informs the rest, who will wait outside. Once Ramondo leaves the building, Marco would use his shadowing skill to follow him unnoticed. The rest would follow later. The suspect was indeed in the lodge. Inside the building there was also a termite infestation that Yoel helped to deal with, but once he left, the plan proceeded according to plan. He shadowed Ramondo to the city gates and then outside, eventually stopping when Ramondo entered some inn. When the rest of the group arrived, Marco discussed his plan and went in. Inside, Teres Ramondo was talking to some thuggish-looking man. Marco was rudely asked to leave, as they were having a personal conversation. He refused, and instead ordered some food and drink for himself. The suspects stopped talking, and instead just waited for Marco to leave. In the meantime, Yovel improved his hearing with a spell and tried to listen in. But since they weren't talking anymore, he failed to hear anything important. Irene prayed to Zaros to improve her acting skill. That came up later. Eventually, Connor went in and joined Marco. One of the thugs has had enough and threatened the two, asking them to leave one last time, while brandishing a throwing axe. A fight broke out. Quite quickly, Marco received a major wound from an axe swing and passed out. Connor was holding off two thugs, managed to down one with an all-out attack, after which he received a painful face stab and got stunned. Some lightning bolts and stools were thrown around, but eventually Ramondo teleported away and Irene managed to defeat one of the remaining thugs. All the thugs were tied up and delivered to the Inquisitor. In one of their bags, the characters found a spellbook of fire and lightning battle magic and a strange-looking dagger with a blood-red blade. To be completely honest, this fight almost turned into a TPK, despite my intention of it being an introduction to combat for the new players. But I blame the dice rolls. Anyway, the Inquisitors went to extract some information from the captive thugs, and the characters in the meantime went to Ramondo's home. The home was empty, and Irene managed to find an unfinished letter written by Teres Ramondo to the Inquisition, with a plea to absolve the sins of his son, who got entangled with agents of Jakun, the aforementioned hostile neighboring nation. The next day, the Inquisitors told the characters what they found out. The thugs were indeed Jakunian agents who were basically planning some terror attacks on villages as a preparation for a full-scale invasion. Their next target was Area, a village not that far from the capital. The characters are told to procure some reinforcements in the Knightly Order of the Inexhaustible Chalice and then deal with the incursion. Connor got assigned 6 neophytes of the Knight Order, and the entire party moved out to the village of Area. Upon arrival, they talked to the Elder, explored the area, organized the militia, and waited for the attack. What followed was a bit unusual. Initially, I was planning to use GURPS mass combat here, but I had a realization. None of the characters had that strategy skill. And why would they? I didn't say anything about mass combat during character generation, so it's not the player's fault. And since we had 2 new players who already had a lot to take in, I decided against using mass combat, just to avoid overwhelming them with a completely different subsystem. Instead, I scaled down the fight, but even then, it still was the biggest GURPS fight I have ever seen, about 12 or 14 combatants on each side. We had everything: inexperienced militiamen, inexperienced neophytes, enemy fighters and archers, a hostile dark wizard who was casting Rain of Stones and Flame Jet, a few summoned devils, and even something of a boss fight, a flail-wielding commander clad in plate armor riding a fiendish boar. The fight was quite exciting, even if slow. However, one of the devils I sent at the party with a pain-inducing aura got a lucky crossbow shot in the vitals from afar and passed out before reaching the front line. Eventually, the enemy was defeated. Some were killed, some wounded, some fled. There were some significant casualties among the neophytes and militia too. After patching up, the party, along with some militiamen and neophytes, set out in the assumed direction to the enemy camp. Another big fight with many combatants on each side followed in the camp among the old ruins. Afterwards, the party descended into the dungeon below, fought some crossbowmen and wizards employing hit and run tactics, and eventually found the ritual chamber with the pentagram. 2 wizards, one of which was Ramondo's son, and a couple of spinagons, tiny flying devils that shoot flaming needles, but nothing too deadly. One of the wizards, who seemed to be the main threat, kept failing to cast chain lightning, so the fight was over quite quickly and kind of anticlimactically. The wizards were tied up and taken to the Inquisitors, and that's it. As you could see, this was a short game, but at least it had a proper conclusion. Initially I planned it to have some extra stuff, and I put in some other possible plot hooks, but halfway there I noticed that the players have lost their enthusiasm, so I had to chop away at my plans to make the game end sooner. The final dungeon was supposed to be much larger than just 3 rooms, and these huge fights probably also were a slog for the players, even if I found them enjoyable. Overall, this was an interesting game to me. First, I was surprised that despite the strict character creation guidelines, the party was still very diverse. Second, I realized that I really should mention in advance that I'd like to try out GURPS Mass Combat. Third, I realized that word casting that the Yovel character used is utter trash. It is needlessly complicated despite in the end being almost identical to the normal wizard. At first I thought about how to fix it, but then I just selected the entire word casting section in my setting document and pressed delete. Nothing of value was lost. Finally, the game was unusual because the characters definitely were not good people, well, some of them at least. But all of them served a goal that isn't good in a traditional D&D sense, and their opponents also were quite evil, so this was an evil versus evil kind of game. That was fun to run. But anyway, I hope you learned from my mistakes or just had fun listening to my ramblings. Thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.